Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Piggy, pronoun she, her, and I am an organizer with ASC and core member. Today, I am wearing a green flannel shirt, gold hoops, and a black bun. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for Asian Solidarity Collective's Portal to Liberation 1 year anniversary virtual summit called Asian Americans on the Journey to Abolition. We are here today to celebrate our 1 year anniversary of our Portal to Liberation campaign. This virtual fundraising summit is full of panels, performances, and workshops. Together, we will continue to call on our San Diego Asian communities and non-Asian co-conspirators to enter the Portal to Liberation in solidarity with Black lives, calling us to free ourselves from the police state and culture of policing in order to reimagine a world free from policing and borders. As an Asian-led grassroots organization in San Diego, we rely on the support of community to fund our efforts, and the money we raise for this virtual fundraising event will go towards ASC's capacity building, programming, political education, direct actions, and campaign endeavors, including the continued accessibility services provided for all of our future events. Speaking of accessibility and tech services, today we will have our ASL interpreter, Stephanie Chow, for two of our later future panels on Asian Americans and the Journey to Abolition panel, and the Collective Liberation panel at the end of the day. A big thank you to our accessibility coordinator, Melissa Kelly Colibri. Recordings will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel, and we'll also be posting transcripts post the event on our website, on our YouTube channel as well. We will also be posting transcripts as well, and your kind donations towards our Disability and Language Justice Fund helps us continue to make all of our events accessible. You can find the donate link in the chat. And we'd also like to give a content warning, as some of our speakers may make mentions of violence, abuse, and more that may spark some things that may come up for you. So we ask that you please be gentle with yourselves and do what brings you comfort and whatever makes the most sense for you. So please feel free right now to share your names, pronouns, location, and your organizations in the chat. Before we get started, we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to pass it to Vicente.
Thank you, Miss Piggy. Hello, everyone. My name is Vicente Blas Tyron. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a Power Up intern at ASC. Today, I'm wearing black glasses and a green and white button-up shirt. We'd like to say that we gather today on the traditional land of the indigenous peoples past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations, including where we currently reside in Kumeyaay territory in San Diego. This calls us to commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit and to show up as co-conspirators to indigenous peoples for their rights and sovereignties. And I'll pass it off to Piggy to talk a bit about our mission.
Thank you, Vicente. Asian Solidarity Collectives is a grassroots organization in San Diego, and our mission is to activate Asian American social justice consciousness, condemn anti-Blackness, and build Asian solidarity intersectionally with Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks, people with disabilities, queer and trans people of color, and all oppressed communities. Our work includes political education, community building, and collective action. Our vision is to work for the collective liberation of all communities. When Black folks are free, we are all free. To build Asian solidarity with Black, Brown, Indigenous, LGBTQIA+, people with disabilities. To engage Asian Americans to be liberated from anti-Black racism, model minority myths, internalized colonialism, and white supremacy, to honor Asian American histories, experiences, and peoples as relational to other oppressed communities. We understand Asian American lives through a transnational and anti-imperialist framework. So our origins, the shooting death of Alfredo Longo at the hands of San Diego police officers on September 27th in 2016 was actually a catalyst to form Asian Solidarity Collective. And what began as a call for emergency for psychiatric assistance ended in a deadly confrontation when non-police officers who were not trained to handle psychiatric emergencies arrived at the scene, fatally wounding a distressed and unarmed Alongo, who was grieving the death of a friend who had passed away only days prior. Previously called Asian for Black Lives San Diego, Asian Solidarity Collective emerged in the fall of 2016 in solidarity with the National Movement for Black Lives. Our group began with 5 queer and femme Asian Americans who came together to activate Asian American social justice consciousness and to condemn anti-Blackness, to identify intersectional affirmations, and to build Asian solidarity, Asian Black solidarity, and solidarity with communities of color in San Diego. We continue to remain the only Asian and Asian American progressive grassroots org that organizes with a dialectical approach of advocacy, direct action, political education, service, and civic engagement with a cross-racial solidarity and intersectional framework in San Diego. All right, everyone. At this time, I would like to introduce and welcome ASC's Executive Director, Dr. DJ Cotton Candy. So Dr. DJ Cotton Candy is the People's Hip Hop DJ scholar who was born and raised in Queens, New York, and is widely regarded as one of the most legendary and accomplished women DJs in the world. Candy is a queer, gender-fluid, femme, disabled Filipinx, Pinay, American writer, poet, theater performer, educator, hip-hop feminist, and community organizer for over 25 years. DJ Cotton Candy is a global hip hop and cultural ambassador with Next Level's Meridian International Center and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the U.S. Department of State Bureau and Educational and Cultural Affairs, where she currently serves as a site manager for their Next Level program. Candy is the co-founder and executive director of ASC, and Candy has co-founded several other local orgs, such as the Mutual Aid We All We Got San Diego, the D.D. McClurell Bail Fund. She's also a co-founder of national organizations People's Collective for Justice and Liberation and the University. And more recently, DJ Cotton Candy has received an honorary doctorate in Pinayism for her endless dedication to radical sisterhood, critical praxis, and transformative solidarity. All right, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the nice introduction, Piggy. Hi, everyone. My name is Candy, pronouns she and they. For visual description, I'm wearing glasses and a black shirt with white font text that reads "No More Prisons." And I am in my music studio office with DJ equipment behind me, record shelves and bookshelves with a window with a tree in the background outside. Friends, as a longtime organizer and abolitionist, what I'm seeing in this moment is a crucial time for us to be even more vigilant than we ever had before in our organizing work, at our critical thinking skills, at our movement building, at showing up for one another, at our community care, and our loving one another. More than ever, we are seeing the ways in which the carceral state has led us to this crux, making the connections to how we ended up to this moment where right-wing fascists propel and instigate an organized flooding of school board meetings fighting against mask mandates and critical race theory, to an eviction disaster approaching, to climbing unemployment, to an increasing global climate crisis, to Afghanistan at a humanitarian crisis in need of an urgent safe haven and aid. All of this while under a global pandemic where in the United States we have had over 628,000 people who have died from COVID-19. It is often discussed in my We All We Got mutual aid crew that came together when COVID-19 emerged to keep us safe. None of this is normal. The education system itself has never been normal. The healthcare system isn't normal. Capitalism isn't normal. It should never be normal. The fact that people have to fight for their basic necessities to survive isn't normal. The fact that many disabled people have always had to worry about care rationing and how it impacts people with certain disabilities is not normal. The fact that people with disabilities have always been denied accessibility requests to do remote work and learning for years. But as soon as COVID-19 emerged, all of the sudden it's in demand and now stripped away from them is not normal. The fact that we have to fight a local scored district for our children's dignity and humanization for special education that is equitable and safe while under a pandemic isn't normal. Yet we treat all of it as such. I make mention of all of these things because all of this is really carceral. The way the state, elected officials, governments, and public health are rolling out decisions are really carceral. It is often said that COVID-19 has revealed inequities as ways in which these systems have always failed us. But to be quite honest, the only people who this is actually being revealed to are people who never experienced or lived these inequities from these systems to begin with. This is nothing new for so many of us. Disabled, poor, working class, neurodivergent, queer, trans, non-binary, Black, brown, indigenous people of color communities know this truth. Black feminist disability studies have always taught me that racism and ableism have always been intertwined. Anyone outside the desirability and lookability politics, anyone outside of those norms, as Roberts had learned us back in 1997, had their rights taken away as they were also questioned. This is how the undesirables have been categorized, surveilled, policed, erased, minimized, incarcerated, and punished to be removed. This has always been the reality from which many have lived and experienced. Many are familiar with this fear and worrisome that they are only being given the ration. Many know the uncertainty. This has been plenty of the reality. This is the normalcy many have always refused. As a disabled person myself, I reject all of the normalcy. I reject the idea that this is what we have to return to. We have never been the normal. Thus, returning to normalcy is really the reopening, the return to comforting to the standard of white supremacy when we've never been close to begin with. Because people, let's be clear, all this time have been working as frontline workers, service workers, healthcare workers, organizers out on those streets, protecting and communities, keeping us safe. We, white supremacies, capitalism, necrocapitalism, necropolitics, to which James Tyner described necropolitics, necrocapitalism in their book Death Labor, a system that not only lets die, but makes death productive as a vehicle for accumulation. In a carceral state, it is very clear who they decide who gets to live. We cannot be reliant on a system that is carceral because, as many abolitionists and organizers have been saying, we all we got. We can only keep us safe. This pandemic is not a moment for us to adapt. Rather, it is a moment for us to critically think, to be even more critical than we've ever had before. It is a moment for us to rebuild and start anew. What would this world look like and possibly be if we did, quote, more than just survive, like my good friend Bettina Love states in her book? What possible futures can we create if we talk about transformation? This is our moment to not conform, but to reclaim and to be undesirable. There's a saying and a principle in the disability rights movement since its beginning. Nothing about us without us. And there's a lot we can learn from this statement alone. Because if we center those who are most vulnerable and those most impacted, we would not be leaving people behind. It was Sins Invalid that stated we move together with nobody left behind. Yet capitalism, racial capitalism, disaster capitalism, necro capitalism, imperialism capitalism, neoliberal capitalism needs normalcy to continue. This normalcy in which folks want to return to is an idea of perfectionism, which is a falsity stemming from a white supremacist cis heteropatriarchy framing that is ableist. It is ableist because perfectionism buys into an idea of a false norm and a standard that does not exist and should not exist. A false norm, a false belief that creates a condition in which others are more desirable while others are not. It needs to other all of us. It needs to hyper labor us. It needs to hyper surveil us in order to cage Black, brown, indigenous, people of color all over the world. This is why we need a disparate practice and approach to our work, our practices, and our organizing. Look to the work of my good friend Sabini on disparate pedagogy. Because if we lead with disability justice in our lives, we will never leave people behind. Because as Leah Lakshmi wrote in her book, in their book, Care Work, you will become us. Realize you are or will be us. COVID-19 should be the awakening for all of us, if it not already. To do without necro-capitalism, to be abolitionists, we must ask ourselves, what are we willing to give up? Because that is what's going to take to do the right, just thing, to make the decisions that gives us community care, to do the alternative right now in this moment. To do disability justice is the alternative. This is community care, and community care is abolition. Because as long as white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy exists, all forms of oppression will exist. So once we get to that understanding that violence is entrenched from and with white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, then we can understand that all forms of oppressions are connected. This means that we cannot just end anti-Asian racism without ending anti-Black racism, anti-indigeneity, classism, sexism, ableism, fat phobia, homophobia, biphobia, queerphobia, transphobia, whorephobia, xenophobia, just to name a few. Ending ableism is abolition. Ending anti-Black racism is also the work to end anti-Asian racism. Solidarity movement building is ending anti-Asian racism. Abolition is ending anti-Asian racism. Ending ableism is ending anti-Asian racism too. This is abolition. As a Asian American, as a Filipinx, to me, this means that if we believe in justice, we believe in liberation. And if we believe in humanization, where we see each other whole, then we must fight for not just our own liberation, but for the liberation for all oppressed peoples. More than ever, this is the time where we must build together, build across, and build solidarity. Abolitionist Marian Kaba, in their newest book, wrote, "We do this till we free us," titled one of their chapters, "Show Up and Don't Travel Alone. We Need Each Other." I hope you all enjoyed today and learn from all of our good folks that have contributed today. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you throughout the day. Thank you. Really good friend of mine, someone I admire tremendously and who's doing amazing work. And I'm excited that they're here joining us this morning. for coming in a bit early, which is great. It's always good to be on time. So I'm really excited that he has joined us today, and who is also one of our newest Asian Solidarity Collective members. So excited for him to join our crew. His name is Dylan Rodriguez, who is a teacher, writer, and scholarly activist. He was named to the inaugural class of Freedom Scholars in 2020 and recently served as president of the American Studies Association. He has worked as a professor at the University of California, Riverside since 2001 and was the faculty elected chair of the UCR division of the Academic Senate. Prior to his Senate leadership, he was the chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies. Dylan's work addresses the normalized proliferation of oppressive violence in everyday state, cultural, and social formations. He conceptualizes abolitionists and other forms of movement as part of the historical collective genius of rebellion, survival, and radical futurity. He is the author of 3 books, most recently White Reconstruction, Domestic Warfare, and the Logic of Racial Genocide, and is co-editor of Critical Ethnic Studies, a reader. Dylan can be reached and contacted through his amazing work all over. You will see him. I'm just so excited that he's here joining us for a Q&A with us this morning to offer a good framing of what does it mean in this time to be an abolitionist. Thank you for joining us, Dylan.
Hey, this is a fundraiser, right? So I should start by making a pledge or something, and you know what I mean, and like calling people to match my pledge or something like that, right? That's what we're supposed to be doing, right? Generous introduction. Thank you so much. I'm Dylan Rodriguez. I'm pledging $150 right off the bat. If that's not enough, say so. I'll pledge more. And others should match me if you can afford it. If it's $1.50, if it's $15, you know what I mean? Like I just threw a number out there, so let's do it. Hey, I know we're starting early. That means we have more time to run our mouths, right? and we can still stay on schedule. Thank you for that generous introduction again. I'm really honored to be invited into the group and into the conversation. I'm Dylan. I'm speaking to you all from occupied Kauai Tongva land in Southern California. They call the city Corona. I work at UC Riverside, which is down the street from where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of Taisha Miller. 1998, shortly before I became a faculty member. Visual description, I'm brown, I'm Pinoy, I cut my hair recently. I'm wearing a Cops Off Campus gray t-shirt, and I got a painting of George Jackson, honoring George Jackson behind me, and a badass original actual Public Enemy poster from the Nation of Millions album that a good friend of mine liberated from a New York City bus stop a long time ago, and I'm just holding on to it for her until she So that's
I'm
me.
Jealous.
Tell me about it. Tell me about it. No, I always was warning my colleague and friend that I was going to steal it from her office. And so when she left to take a job in New York, she said I could hold on to it for her. So there it is.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing already. I'm excited to have you here, and I want to start off with a question for you, and I'm just going to let you go off because I know you're going to break it down for us real easily and importantly for us. I've heard you talk about how abolition is our moral obligation once. Tell us, for us as Asians and Asian Americans, why is it now more than ever important for us to do abolition, be abolitionists? What's at stake for us if we do or we don't?
So let me start by saying that this is the topic of, I think, a perpetual long conversation, a long form conversation that we need to have collectively. So in my mind, what you and I can do in these few minutes, precious minutes we have, is kind of stage that and provoke that for a longer collective discussion among all our folks here. So let me start by framing how I understand and enter abolition as a collective practice, as a collective act of art, of creativity, of critical work, of teaching, of organizing, and so forth. It is part of a centuries-long Black radical and Black revolutionary diasporic tradition. That's how I understand it. That's how I have been welcomed generously into the work. And I think that needs to be central to how we think and do the work of abolition, because otherwise we run the risk of abstracting it from its foundations, which means two things. One is that we actually reproduce the logics of anti-Black violence and genocide by doing so. And secondly, we hesitate to burn the fucking plantation down, right? The minute we do that abstracting from the Black revolutionary and radical tradition, it increases the possibility that we will be solicited and seduced into reformist practices, liberal practices, sometimes they call them progressive, and even social justice practices that are actually about reproducing the plantation rather than burning the fucker down, right? So I know that there's a lot of necessary talk about abolition as creation, as making, as creativity that is central to everything abolition has always been.
Mm-hmm.
I think in this moment, it is also critical to understand that abolition is also about stopping things. It's about getting rid of certain things. I've said it over and over again for almost my whole adult life. You don't play with genocide. If you recognize a system as genocidal, as colonial, right, as based on the logics of chattel slavery, you don't mess with that, right? Your objective is to abolish it, destroy it, right? Survive it, of course, right? We have to do certain things tactically to survive those deadly systems. But the point and the principle and the objective is to destroy those systems. At the same time that you're also exemplifying a certain kind of love and joy and community and creativity and experimentation that already anticipates what you want as you destroy the plantation. So that's the first thing that I think all of us here need to understand, right? Whether we identify as Asian American or Filipinx or Pinoy, etc. That's what we need to understand. And I think for this particular crowd that we're part of today, what we need to have a really clear political analysis of is how it is that people who are identified as Asian American, etc., especially in the U.S. context, are subjects of recruitment into a couple different things that are deeply dangerous. One is they're subjects of recruitment into different forms of affinity and solidarity with the state, right? So when we say Asian Solidarity Collective, right, and that's the work we're doing, and we're on side of oppressed communities, then I think that there's a special, heightened obligation to have that kind of an analysis. How is it that some of the folks that we identify as our own are being invited into solidarity with the state, especially the policing, criminalization, incarcerating apparatus regime, right? They all overlap, right? And the best example recently, the most conspicuous example recently, is obviously #StopAsianHate. Now, I'm gonna try to say this gently, but I'm also not gonna compromise my criticism, okay? Because I know a lot of us here have been involved with it, you know what I mean? But Stop Asian Hate, in the end, it's from the beginning to the end. It's actually part of that problem I'm talking about, right? Because on the one hand, it is premised on addressing what is really deep white nationalist violence, right? And the casualties of white nationalist violence, which is, by the way, multicultural, right? White nationalism is not exclusive to white people. Right. For shit, we see Filipinos, we see Asian Americans, etc., that are on the side of white nationalism. So when I say that, I'm not just talking about white folks. I'm principally talking about white folks, but not exclusively. All right. So when we look at the logic of Stop Asian Hate, I'm talking about the mainstream logic. What is it you see celebrities and pundits talking about in their social media and on CNN and MSNBC and whatnot? What they're talking about is a reliance on the FBI and on the police to, number one, identify so-called hate crimes. Now, anybody who takes even a brief look at the problems with hate crime prosecution, hate crime legislation, you'll see right away that is not a reliable tool to address white nationalist violence. Never has been. There's been places and moments where the primary targets of criminalization of hate crimes are actually oppressed peoples, right? They've been queer and gender non-conforming people, non-binary people. They've been Black people. They've been people, of Mexican descent, Chicanx people, and so forth. So on the one hand, there's that, right? On the other hand, what we also saw in the early part of this year were these cherry-picked spectacles of Black perpetrators. There was a cherry-picked visual arrangement in which one would be led to believe that Black men are the primary perpetrators of anti-Asian violence, which empirically is complete bullshit. Okay, we have no evidence of any of that. But anyway, so Asians and Asian Americans being pulled into anti-Blackness all the time. That's one piece. The other piece is reformism, which I've already alluded to. That's just the idea that the existing system, which I think has to be called asymmetrical domestic war. That's the condition that we are in. That's what movements have been basically saying for many years, right? This is a condition of asymmetrical, undeclared domestic war. You were saying this is not normal, right? And that's the tension. It is not
Yes.
normal. At the same time, the state tries to normalize this, right?
Yep.
And not call it domestic war. They call it law and order.
Yes.
They call it peace.
Absolutely.
They call it democracy. So the problem, as well as how Asians, Asian Americans, Filipinos, et cetera, are being brought into this kind of affinity with the idea that the existing system of asymmetrical domestic war can be adjusted to be tolerable and just. So those are the two things that I'd say we need to address as different kinds of overlapping collectives, and go from there. We're running out of time already, man. Can we have another half an hour?
I know. Well, that just means we got to keep having you back, Dylan. I mean, you broke it down really importantly. I mean, really significantly in the fact that you're mentioning all that we see with the whole anti-Asian hate and what makes it feel like this is it's not there, and where we need to dig deep. So, tell me in this, like, what you're seeing now in this moment, right now, globally, that's happening, and you clearly see that there's a system really fighting really harder than ever to keep it functioning.
Yeah.
So what are the connections we need to draw right now from all of that to what's happening in the world globally to what we've got to do as abolitionists now?
Right on.
Like, what is it going to take?
All right. So I know we have a few minutes. I'm going to try. Apologies for talking fast, like slow my ass down on the recording, whatever, and just sending love to all you. I'm going to hang on for a few minutes after this and just listen to folks. All right. I got three things I'm going to say again. What I really see happening is that reformism, that is the ideology, and really it's kind of a pseudo-religious belief. That's the notion that the horizon, the outer limits of political change are only are defined by adjustments to an existing set of institutions. That's what reformism is. That's the belief, right? In other words, it is absolutely counter and anti-abolitionist. It is counter and anti-revolutionary. It is against radical foundational transformation. That's what reformism ism, right? Reformism. That is the front line of what we are in now. We're in the opening stages of it, especially in terms of police reform. We see it everywhere. We see it in cities. We see it in counties. We see it in states and federal. We see it in universities. We see it in colleges. We see it in K through 12, right? The front line of counterinsurgency against current abolitionist struggle, freedom struggle, and self-defense struggle, which is in many ways what the movement for Black Lives and other overlapping movements are doing. They are being undermined by reformism, which at its heart is about a re-legitimation of policing and police power, right? Let me say that again to be really clear. What I see happening globally is a scramble, an institutional scramble to initiate waves of police reform, guided by reformist ideology to, number one, re-legitimate policing as a form of power, as a normalized form of power, how societies work, as the thing that is necessary to bring societies into peaceful function, right? Ironically, into peaceful function. Policing as a form of power, and then the police as an institution. That's the front line of counterinsurgency right now, is re-legitimation of policing and police as an institution. Second, I think we need to rethink constantly what the labor of solidarity actually is. We need to center the work of collective study. Right. The biggest weakness I see in many collectives and organizations I'm part of is a kind of disengagement or a kind of short time that for collective study. Solidarity is a dynamic praxis. It is a dynamic period of constant reflection in a collective group. It's not an accomplishment. You don't just accomplish solidarity. So collective study is critical to this. And in addition to what you raised in your opening comments, which is what are you willing to give up as part of the solidarity practice and reflection, I want to say, what are we also willing to do to collectively experiment? Right, coming out of collective study, right? That there's some fun shit we get to do.
Yes.
If we get engaged in collective study, is collective experimentation. The last point is to come back to the initial point that I keep harping on here, which is not only do we need to have an analysis of reformism, there has to be a commitment to constantly, militantly opposing reformism, and that's a hard thing to do. Because a lot of us are pulled into reformist struggles all the time, and it becomes difficult to kind of pull apart a tactical support for a specific kind of reform measure or reform campaign that is primarily usually defensive, right? We're trying to just prevent casualties of some of our folks and vulnerable loved ones around us. But on the other hand, challenging reformism as a political religion. We need to oppose it's fundamentalism. Reformism is a form really of political fundamentalism. So there has to be militant opposition to that. That's what I think abolitionists have always done, right? Abolitionists have always said, you fuckers that want to say there's an incremental way to end slavery, bullshit. We're abolitionists and we are stopping that. There were abolition people, white abolitionists were saying that incremental bullshit, right?
Yes,
and it's the Black radical tradition that said, no, we will not tolerate this. And we can go on and on, but that's what I think we need to be centering here as a principle of solidarity.
Wow, Dylan, you just gave us a framework to work off of. So I appreciate that. That definitely was fire. Thank you for sharing that knowledge, Dylan. I think it's really crucial. I'm appreciative what the wisdom that you brought us today and offering this framing for us today, in which we'll be working through. And also, like, in general, the time you've committed with us at Asian Solidarity Collective. You just spent a portion of your time with us, even in our abolitionist series class, and willing to come back. So thank you so much, Dylan, for your time and joining us.
Hey, thank you so much for inviting me. I'll stay. I'm gonna listen to y'all. So this is great. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dylan. I'm gonna hand it off back to our host crew over here. Thank you.
Yes, just to reiterate, thank you so much, Dylan, for sharing all your knowledge and experience and setting off the energy and vibe for today's event. And thank you, Candy, for the Q&A, such a powerful discussion, just to start off and get our mind thinking about some really important topics. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first performer. Speaking of power, we are proud to introduce the first performance of the summit. Everyone welcome ASC's Youth Committee. Today, our youth will be reciting a collective poem titled To Be Free. This past month, ASC's active member, Fung Vung, joined the Youth Committee to provide mentorship and guidance with writing workshops. We will be introducing each member, starting with AK. AK's pronouns are she, her. AK is a dancer and youth organizer from Asian Solidarity Collective. She believes in the power of using your voice and encouraging others to speak on what they believe is right. Our next performer in the youth committee is Doom, pronouns he, his. Doom is a b-boy young organizer from Kumeyaay Land in San Diego, representing his crew Cypher State and the organization ASC. Iman, pronouns she, her. As a Filipinx, Latinx, Muslim young woman, Iman is a rising senior whose involvement includes Assembly member Dr. Shirley Ann Weber's Youth Legislative Program, Muslim Youth Leadership Program, the Kroc IPJ's Social Fabric Initiative, Youth in Dentistry, and Gen Up San Diego. She is passionate about inclusivity and the diverse representation in the K-12 system. She believes in challenge the single-story narrative where everyone's authentic voice is validated and empowered. She understands that we must collectively tackle oppression because all struggles are intersectional. Kaya, pronouns she, her. Kaya is a young organizer and artist from Southeast San Diego. As a former Philippine folk dancer and current high school photography major, Kaya values art, music, culture, and family. She hopes to make positive change within our society as a youth committee member from ASC. Last but not least, Pebbles Love, pronouns she, her. Pebbles Love is a Filipina and Okinawan artist/actress, B-girl, and young organizer. She believes in continuously expanding her critical mindset and growing through life experiences. Her mission is to build solidarity and elevate with people of all generations and community through art and action towards collective liberation. Please give a hand and let's welcome ASC's Youth Committee.
Okay, to be free. One fragile seed is the soul, my inner being, bundled in my sanctuary, sheltered but curious. My ancestral soil nurtures my strength, prosperity, and cultura, embraces me, reclaims me. As the rain trickles down, the seed begins to break free of comfort and fear, sprouting roots deep and wide of identity and affirmations. Through seasons of blooming, I grow firm and unscathed. The sun warms my spirit, watches over me, always guiding me as I bow in its direction. Knowledge of self. I am free. We are free. We are free.
Individuality brings us together. Together is when we are better. Better is to defy the majority. The majority takes away more of me. As we are expected to assimilate, it's important to express our true freight and embrace our culture. I am me, I am me.
Abolition, wishing for abolition, dreaming of a world with collective liberation. I don't want to drown in oppression or be swayed by white supremacist temptations. Want to live where everyone is freed from the shackles we are lifted. Let's get lifted, let's get lifted.
Point of view, developed by experiences we've been through. We all have different experiences, creating an endless variety of points of view. However, we only know our own. Why not come together and share our views so we can learn and grow? The system instills lies and fear. They don't want the truth to be known. Together, we can fill that void and rise against the system. Burn the system, burn the system.
Don't sleep on the strength that revolutionary love holds. From the new gen to the old, continuing the fight to abolish the system because we are too radical to fit in their mold. We must hold each other close, hold each other accountable, for together we will get there, get to our dream, to be free, to be free.
Wow, what an amazing performance. Thank you so much, ASC Youth Committee. Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Candy. Thank you, Vicente and Piggy, for being here and hosting this great event. I'm so excited for today, and there's so much more that we have in store for you. Everyone, please give it up for the Youth Committee if you're in the chat. I know there's no emojis on there, but you can put some hand claps and some hearts. You are all filled with so much fire and you give so much energy and light to the future. And this poem truly represents collectivity and the work that will lead to the world that we dream of. So thank you everyone for sharing so much. So we're actually ahead of schedule, surprisingly, and we have a little break going on right now. So we encourage you to take the next 15 to 20 minutes for all your needs. We'll be dropping the donation link in the chat, so please feel free to donate or help share this link with others. We appreciate all the support and everything that you all have given us, emotional, donation, or otherwise. So enjoy the break, and we will return at 10:35 for a panel that you don't want to miss. It's called Asian Americans and the Journey to Abolition. So we'll see you soon. All right, welcome back, everyone. We hope you had a good break and took all the time that you needed to rest and recharge for this next upcoming panel. My name is Stacy. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a member of Asian Solidarity Collective. For visual purposes, I'm a light-skinned Asian Filipina person. I have green hair in 2 buns at the top of my head, and I'm wearing black frame glasses and a plaid shirt. So we are excited to introduce the, oh, I'm sorry, let me add the ASL interpreter. Thank you, Stephanie. So we are so excited to bring on the next panel of the summit, Asian Americans and the Journey to Abolition. Before we begin, we would like to give a special thanks to our accessibility coordinator, Melissa Kelly Colibri, pronouns they and them, and our ASL interpreter for the panel, Stephanie Chow, pronouns she and her. Thank you so much for being here. So our moderator for this panel is Josen Diaz. Josen Masangay Diaz, pronouns she, her, and they and them, is a student and teacher of race, gender, colonialism, and authoritarianism. She is an assistant professor of ethnic studies at the University of San Diego, and Josen is also a founding core member of ASC. So Josen, take it away, and I'll let you introduce the panel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stacy, for that introduction. So I'm really excited to moderate this panel today. There's some really great folks that I'm excited to learn from. So I'll go ahead and introduce the panelists first, and then we'll bring them on and hear more from them. So unfortunately, Suparna Khadija is one of the wonderful core members of ASC who won't be able to make it today, unfortunately, but we're looking forward to learning more from her and elevating her work in the near future. So one of our panelists, A.T. Furuya, who uses they, them pronouns, lives on Kumeyaay land. They are a trans, agender, queer, Japanese American organizer. The majority of their focus is in helping LGBTQ plus youth access basic life necessities and also opportunities to thrive. They build, act, struggle, and grow within a transformative justice framework, meaning they believe in accountability as care, and they believe in prison abolition. AT and their partner Dominic have a bunny named Mina and are full-time caregivers for Auntie Joy, a living legend. Sarath Suong uses he and him pronouns. He was born in Khao Dang refugee camp after his family fled Cambodia's civil war. They resettled in his hometown of Revere, Massachusetts, where he learned about community organizing as a working class queer refugee. Sarath is the national director of Southeast Asian Freedom Network, a movement family of Southeast Asian grassroots organizations united to fight for abolition. So thank you both, AT and Sarath, for joining us here today. So I'll go ahead and start, and I want to hear more about both of you and just your work. So my question here today is just, how did you all arrive at abolitionist work? Either AT or Sarath to start.
Okay, I can jump in. All right. So hi, thank you for the welcome, and happy to be here, especially the Asian Solidarity Collective has been really much needed space in San Diego. And so I just appreciate all the work that everyone's put into making this weekend happen. So how did I get involved in abolitionist work? About 8 years ago, I was trying to leave. And so content warning, I feel like talking about abolition and especially like transformative justice in any way, there's going to be heavy mentions of different experiences. So I'm going to be talking about specifically domestic violence, not in detail, but I will be mentioning that. And so about 8 years ago, I was trying to leave an abusive relationship. I did not know how, and I really just felt stuck and conflicted. I just started reading The Revolution Starts at Home, which is an anthology edited by Leah Lakshmi and Chingen Chen and Jai Dulani. This like left me feeling, oh gosh, like what do I do? And I want like to embody a lot of the things discussed in resolution, solution. I just felt I was at a point in my activism where I hadn't thought about what this system means to people in my community. And so yeah, this was the first time I'd learned about the concept of getting to the root of a problem instead of like addressing one action or moment. And in just learning about transformative justice and not knowing many others at the time, when it was time for me to leave the relationship I was in, I was like, what do I do? Do I file a police report to keep him away from me? Could this potentially put another queer brown person in jail? So what else can I do? And I didn't have the resources in San Diego. There was a group of us who had started the Makikua Project, which was a queer and trans BIPOC org. But we were all really like trying to figure out, there just wasn't enough of us. Like there wasn't the kind of support that was needed. And I ended up filing a restraining order and I went to court. And while my safety was the priority, like in the end, I did not feel safer, nor did I feel that I received justice of any type. Like it didn't make me feel good to do all of those things. And when someone, a close friend of mine asked, like, what would you have needed to feel safer and to feel justice? And I said, transformation. Like I need change. I want to know that this person is not going to continue being harmful. And I'll also say that like, nowhere in that time did I feel safe around the police. The safety that I felt was when I was surrounded by community members who I knew were looking out for me, who I knew were listening to my story. And that changed, I think, how I moved forward in thinking about organizing. And so I was going to all these TJ workshops. I was looking at my life and how like my organizing skills, who I, as a mentor to young people, what was I doing in my own practices at the youth drop-in center that we were running? How was I reevaluating our own like boundaries and like if a student violated that, like were we just kicking them out or were we, what was the process? And so that's where I've like continued on that road to today. And that's really like how I got here, was that first moment of how am I safe, and then how am I keeping my people safe? And I think at the root of it, this like idea growing up as a kid that the police, that the system, that going to prison was gonna somehow rehabilitate people, like. And then the harsh reality as, you know, an adult that no, that's not going to happen. And no, I've never experienced that, but I've just been fed those words all the time without necessarily a specific example to an alternative. And then not realizing I have the power to dream what that alternative is myself. Like I never thought that I could think of and I could build and create what that alternative is too. I never felt I had that kind of power. So that's what led me to where I am in my involvement and just kind of my own realization and growth over time.
Thank you so much. Sir.
Thank you, folks, for the invitation. Thank you, AT, for sharing. I really appreciate you sharing your story. Yeah, so hey, everybody. Sarath here. Based in beautiful, the Ocean State, the smallest state, the biggest hot, I say, here in Rhode Island, or Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Poconoke territory. But thank you for having me here today. So how did I arrive to abolition? I feel like this is such an interesting question. You know, I think for me, I was born into abolitionist work, and I'll explain that. I was born in the, you know, like Josen said in my intro, I was born in the biggest refugee camp that during the Vietnam War. We called it here the Vietnam War, but we called over there the American War, right? The wars in Southeast Asia. And you know and so my parents, after the U.S. destabilized, messed up our countries, rained bombs on us, left. There was a communist coup in Cambodia, which resulted in a genocide. And my parents, like hundreds of thousands of others, fled to the nearby Thai borders to seek refuge in camps. And I was born in the camps, and my parents talked to me about how I was born, just kicking and screaming, and just never stopped screaming. And they said, you know, and then we eventually resettled in Boston, Massachusetts, where I was raised. And growing up as a queer, poor refugee, Khmer refugee. Refugee from Cambodia, especially in the 80s and 90s, in a city like Boston was really hard. So if you think about it, right, we sort of we came at the perfect storm at that time in this country, around the war on drugs, around the Clinton administration building more, expanding prisons. Private prisons were growing, the police was growing, the idea of the super predator was growing. And so we came at a really, I think, unique time where, you know, we came at a moment where all that was happening. We were a reminder of a war that the U.S. wanted to forget, right? And I think for us, we were brought to the U.S. as part of the largest refugee resettlement program in U.S. history. Which included over 1.4 million folks from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And, you know, like I was saying, the U.S. promised to resettle us through the refugee resettlement program of 1980 and stabilize us, but instead they abandoned us, right? And so we were sort of we were resettled in under-resourced, over-policed neighborhoods with failing schools, with high racial profiling. And that was sort of the reality for me growing up. And so that meant that I saw the police beat up my neighbors, right? That meant that I saw the school system pushing out my peers and my siblings. That meant that waking up at 13 years old to walk to school to know that there was 4 houses of refugee families that were burnt down the night before because of arson. And that meant that at the age of 13, my best friend was killed by the police. And so for me, it was really, I was trying to understand and make sense of who we were and why we were here in this country. and my older siblings and my family were too traumatized with their sort of their journey here to talk about it. So I remember being a young, really frustrated, really angry young person, and I walked into a community center, and they sort of took me in, and they they said they taught me two really important lessons. They said that everything that was happening to us, that it was not our fault. I think as growing up Buddhist, I thought, oh, it's karma, maybe something, we did something, but no, they said it's not our fault. And more importantly, they said that there are larger systems at play. And then as I began to learn about things like U.S. military, like war, like capitalism, like racism, and then they also taught me that if we join together, if we build community, that if we love each other and support one another, and if we sort of organize and we come together and that we can really change the material conditions of what we're living in. And I was like, oh wow, that's one way. That's the way that I want to channel all my rage and anger, and frustration. And so I think that's sort of, and I talk about that because that's sort of my entry into community organizing, right? And through community organizing, I was able to put into practice and into language and into my heart about like, what are we organizing for? That if what we're saying as Southeast Asians is that the U.S. military is the biggest perpetrator of violence in our lives, and the reasons why we became refugees in the first place, then it is our responsibility and duty to dismantle the U.S. military to help stop the creation of refugees like us. And that sort of led me in my personal and political development trajectory into thinking more about this idea about what abolition can look like. What would a world without government-sanctioned violence, without a police system, without prisons, without war, without military, without borders, what could that look like? And as a community that is entangled so much within this broken immigration system, within this really messed up criminal legal system, my organizing has, and my lived experience shaped my idea about my sort of passion for what abolition can look like. And really sort of, I think, base a lot of my work and my life's work into a world, towards working towards that world.
Oh, I appreciate both of you all, those answers, especially I think one of the things I'm hearing especially are the, I do think that which is great, like folks are coming into abolition as a sort of newer movement, but I think what both AT and Saratha, you both are saying is that it's always been here, but Saratha, the way you put it, right, you're born into abolition, and both of you have kind of discussed the ways that you all grapple with and fight against the violence, state violence, kind of the violence of everyday experience through the materiality of your lives, right? Like it's something that you experience intimately and something that you believe in individually. So, related to that, I wonder, you both are organizers and have organized various places throughout your lives. What ways do you all practice abolitionist principles in your own organizing? And we can start with AT. I think you mentioned this also in San Diego, the Makikua Project, working with youth. But what ways do you practice these abolitionist principles in your organizing?
So it's not easy. It's like really hard because I'm like constantly shedding ideas about punishment and false fantasies that the system will protect me, and that every day I'm like, oh, where did that come from? Like, oh shit, like I didn't realize that I was holding myself back or holding other people back by certain behaviors or ideas that I thought were the way, right? How I've been conditioned. And so I feel like every day it's like, okay, what can I shed today that has been planted in my mind as a young person that I still need to get rid of? And so I think for me, like the practicing like abolitionist principles is, how am I showing up in my everyday? Like how am I everything, like, and I believe that the transformative justice framework is about accountability and reflection and not responding with further violence or relying on the state. And so when I think about that, it's like, how does this very large and complicated idea of transformative justice and abolition work, like, how do I bring that in on a smaller scale to me as an individual? So I think that's number one. And then how, like, I don't want to go to work and say like, oh, well, this is my job, right? Like, this is what we do. And then when I leave work, I'm this like fighting for abolition. Like, how do I bring and incorporate my values into my job? And if my job does not allow me to do that, then as hard as it is, I have to start looking for another job. And so I have to also evaluate, like, where am I compromising? What harm is that compromising doing? And what can I do to work towards shifting that compromise to not be like, all right, well, it's not that big of a harm. Like, how do I just continue? And I think that diligence is like permeating out into everything that I'm trying to be involved in. I think it's also the trust building. I think that's a huge part of it. In order to help folks change, there has to be trust. I think of like Miriam Kaba, who is anytime I can listen to her speak, I try to, because I just learned so much. But something that she said too is like, think of a time when you transform, when you changed your behavior, and who is involved in that. And it's always been with people I trusted. And so when we build that trust and we show up for each other as a community, I think it allows us to believe that like accountability and holding each other to that accountability is an act of love, not just for the person who's been harmed, but for the person who caused harm and for everyone else. And so I think it's shifting the framework. And so how am I, and I shared this with the ASC group a couple weeks ago. So another practice is I used to, like, I'm really good at calling people out. Like, I'm really good at it. Like, I'm so good at making a post and slamming people and being like, I am not saying this is not, it's a conflict. Like, I struggle because I'm like, I want justice and I want like this, I want this person to pay. And I'm like, oh, that's punishment. I want this person punished in my immediate feelings. And so I'm constantly navigating, like, how does my voice get heard? How do I not recreate violence? And violence could be isolation, like isolating someone who's harmed. And yeah, we don't want them to harm other people, but they're not going to transform and heal and not harm others by isolating. And those are like ideas of prison, right? Like, we may not be sending people to prison, but we're sending them to social prison, community prison, if you will. And that's by cutting them off of all supplies and resources to help them actually transform. So I'm in constant conflict with, if it's a person, if it's an organization. I mean, I think it's not black and white, right? Like, there's some politicians or elected officials that need to be called out. And so I think it's like addressing behavior, shifting from labeling people as rapists, as abusers, but saying like people's behaviors have been, because I think that as hard as it is, and it does not feel good when I hear someone defending someone who harmed in a way that's like, they need to transform too. And I'm like, I feel really uncomfortable right now. Like, I've got to sit with this discomfort, because right now, like, again, what's been ingrained in me is punishment. This person needs to be on trial. They need to, and so I think about community, especially, and I talk a lot about community members, because I think I just have, over the years, including myself, have seen folks invested in this work fuck up once and they're out, right? Like there's no redemption, there's no reintroduction, there's no, we don't even allow them the opportunity to reflect on what they've done and be different. And I think that is where we need to rethink even in the difficulties. And if you're someone who's like, no, I will not give them the opportunity, that's okay, right? Like that's all right. And so what I've learned, because like I have removed myself from that process. I do not need to be part of that, that holding a person accountable, because I'm not in a space to do it. My heart is not there. I have punishment on my heart, and I have hurt on my heart, and that's what I want for that person. So I've got to be honest. I need to remove myself. I'm not part of this situation, and then to allow others who do have that space to let that to make sure that person help that person not continue harm, let them grow into their practice, let them grow into holding that space, because I think the other part in my own self-reflection, and I'm a Virgo, so I'm also like, I've got answers for everything, is my answers aren't always right, ouch. And then two, that I shouldn't be in everything. I think when folks become leaders in a certain communities, there's like the go-to, there's an issue, go to that person. And for me, I like to feel needed. I like to feel a part of something. And I had to come to the realization that I am not the person to always do stuff. I'm not always the voice. I'm not always the representation. I'm not always the accountability partner. And so like also reflecting in what is appropriate, where is appropriate for you to do your work and to be present. So I know that that's not like, it's it's not a different approach. I think abolitionist work is not just like hardcore streamed into like these boxes. And I think the parts that what I'm sharing right now are the areas that I'm focusing on. And that's, as it was mentioned, community, like having the community folks that you're connected to. And I think the constant conversation, let's learn about TJ work, let's learn about transformative justice, let's learn about community safety, let's learn about intervention that doesn't involve the state. And right now, like those are the things I have capacity to do. And so that's what I'm focusing on. And then I support other folks that are doing work too, it's like, I don't have the knowledge yet. I don't have the space, but like I can financially support, or I can sign on to things, or I can show up to an event. So those are just some of, it's like I have my core practice, and then I have my support practice, and that's where I'm so if you think of like the pods, right? That's kind of how I organize and think about what am I engaging in today? How am I teaching young people to, how am I like looking for alternatives for them to like not go into the military industrial complex to further harm and genocide across seas. It's like, and that was a huge, I think that created a lot of conflict too, when it was like trans people couldn't join the military and everyone's up in arms, and that's not my battle. I don't believe in fighting for trans people to join a system that is occupying and harming people across in other countries. And so that's not something that I choose to fight for. That's not the representation I want. That's not the representation we need. So I'm going to focus my concerns and work and practice elsewhere. So I think it's like, how do I make those disruptions? How do I, if students feel like, the military targets poor BIPOC students, poor people in general, and all across the country, and especially BIPOC folks. And if folks feel like the military is the only thing they have to get out of a terrible situation, how do we provide those resources so that's not what they're turning to? And I think that's the same with like people wanting to join the police force. Like, oh, I don't have a degree, but I can go to police school for 2 months and become a cop. Like, how do we find alternatives for folks to not feel like that's what they have to turn to in order to be legitimate in our society or to get basic life needs? So, and I know that there's a lot of organizations doing this work in schools as well to make sure that young people aren't we disrupt that streamline, right? That pipeline into creating future oppressors.
Thanks so much. Sarah?
Thanks, AT, for talking about the pipeline, because I was actually going to go into a little bit about that as well. I really appreciate you, AT, bringing your work and stuff, and I want to say that that's really, like, please keep doing that work, and I want to reach out actually, because I need those trainings and those conversations myself. So for me, I think my experience around practicing abolitionist principle is really around organizing, right? Which is to say, I'm not an expert in it. I'm learning about it every single day. And I'm also trying to like practice it in my personal life as well. But I want to talk a little bit about how it shows up in organizing, in movement work. So I think it's okay. I'm trying to figure out how to explain this well. Let me just say this. I think that for me, I want to think about abolition and the sort of the movement sense is that we're dismantling the current systems, right, that don't serve us, and actually more than don't serve us, that really harm us and harm others, right? Police, prisons, military, borders, nations, and to really think about rebuilding, like, right? So rebuilding about new systems and new ways of being, right? Of relating to one another that is based on like safety and dignity, and making sure that we all have room to grow and to love and to be ourselves, right? And it's, and I see abolition as more of a journey than anything, as a journey that we all must collectively agree to walk together, to travel together. But I think in terms of organizing, in terms of like work and campaigns and organizations, it's hard to practice abolitionist principles if we're organizing under the nonprofit industrial complex in a racial capitalist system like the US. So let me just say that, right? That it's near impossible. Now, I think that there are things that we can do to actively sort of like work against that. But at the end of the day, I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that we can organize our way out of abolition, especially if these, especially if we think about funds and capitalism and how that moves our organizations and movements and campaigns. But anyways, I shouldn't be saying that as a national director, but it's okay. But I think that that's part of the reality. So there's some things that we could do, right? I think there's always tension around like, okay, the abolitionists. I mean, also I want to say that this conversation that we're having is new, and that we're having a conversation, but abolitionists and abolition isn't new, right? Thank you so much to the many decades of hard work that Black liberators have done to really sort of open up these opportunities and the national imagination around, what abolition can look like, right? And so for me, I think when I think about policy or campaigns or projects that are move towards abolition, I think about like at the end goal of it, like, is it really taking a brick away, right, from prisons and from the borders, or is it just making it stronger, right? I mean, sometimes it feels really hard to like be able to like spend years and years of work just take one little tiny brick away from that humongous wall, right? But we do it because, like I said, for me, it's part of the journey, right? It's the community we build, the skills that we build, the love that we generate in the community towards taking that small brick away. So let me give an example. So for in Providence, in Rhode Island, I'm a co-founder and a recent former director of an organization called Providence Youth Student Movement, or PRISM, and we were founded in 2001 to sort of to organize Southeast Asian young people, queer and trans youth of color, and who we call survivors of state violence, to fight back against state violence. And our first campaign was around dismantling the gang database, right? Because we knew then that the Providence Police Department was started a gang unit in the gang database in the early 80s to survey and profile and put Southeast Asian young people into this gang database, this secret gang database, right? Just from just walking down the street, hanging out with their friends or going to school, take pictures, stop them to get their phone numbers and their names, put them into this database. The danger in that, as most of us know, is that, if a young person gets put to trial, if there's any connection to a gang, they get enhanced sentencing, right? So that's part of the school to prison to deportation pipeline, right? So we said we got to dismantle that, right? And so then around the same time when we were starting to sort of work around that, we heard that the U.S. had forced Cambodia to accept back folks with deportation orders, right? Which was like another crisis in the community. And so then it was clear to us, okay, we gotta really organize. We gotta build a local, national, and international movement against deportation. And in Providence, we were, after about 10 years, we were able to pass through a lot of work. It was so much work. We were able to pass one of the most comprehensive racial profiling legislation in the country to this day, called the Community Safety Act. And it's this beautiful, it was a beautiful, piece of legislation that didn't dismantle the police or defund the police really, but sort of did things like, the police had to give a ticket or a reason why they stopped anybody. It gave protections around sort of gender expression, gender identity, and for us and for PRISM at that time was really important that it actually provided an appeal process, and a way to sort of start chipping away at the gang database, right? But then while we were doing that work, it was about maybe 6-7 years of work. While we were doing that, we also know that policy isn't going to save us. We can pass all the laws we want, right? But at the end of the day, who's going to really save us is ourselves. And so while we were doing that campaign work, we were also building a cop watch in our neighborhoods, right? We were like, okay, we're going to try to pass this legislation. That's the sexy public news stuff, right? But on the back end and in the communities and the streets, we're going to do neighborhood patrols on our own. We're going to document, right? And we're going to build really strong legal and emotional and financial support resources for our community members who constantly on the daily get harassed and brutalized by the police. But that stuff doesn't really get a lot of attention, right? But that's the stuff that we were working just as hard, if not even harder than the public campaign. And so that's one of the principles I think was really being clear about what is our campaign, what is the work that we're doing, what is the institutional change that we want to do, right? But then at the same time, not just resting on that we actually have to create also the cultural shifts within our communities, and that we actually have to do the defense work ourselves to protect ourselves from state violence, right? And so all that was we were sort of imagining, we didn't think about this, what we were doing, but we were imagining a new way of being in our new neighborhoods and our communities, a new way of protecting each other. We were redefining what safety meant for us, and that meant us protecting each other. And so I want to connect it then to sort of the larger anti-deportation movement that I'm a part of with CFN, Southeast Asian Freedom Network. I've had the honor in the past year to become the national director. And we're a movement family of grassroots local organizing groups that are based in Southeast Asian communities. And we came together 20 years ago to create a united front against the deportation of Cambodians, right? 20 years later, deportations are still happening, but we've been able to keep so many folks off those planes. We've been able to return back a handful of folks, and we're not going to stop until the people have the opportunity to be back with their loved ones. And so the past couple of years, trying to think about who we are and what we're doing, we know that it was clear for us that we want to end the deportation of Southeast Asian refugees from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And then as we were thinking about it more, we said, is that really our end goal, right? I mean, we can't, what are we going to do after, we're going to win, right? We're going to stop the deportation of people. What do we do after that? And so that got us thinking a little bit more about then, what is beyond that, right? And what does it mean for us? What does it mean for us to be thinking about who we are as refugees? What does that mean for if we can understand that we are displaced people and displaced folks, people who are displaced by the U.S. military, right, on stolen land, that was built by Black slaves, right? Then for us, it's really imperative that we join the effort to open the prisons, fight for Black liberation, and give back the land, right? Like that's sort of like our goal. And then folks are like, okay, wow, well, that makes sense. And then it sort of aligned perfectly with other comrades and folks that we were thinking about what abolition could look like as a movement, of folks. So also, just quickly, while we were doing the anti-deportation work, we also learned clearly that we actually needed to also do that with a more intersectional and particularly a gender justice and queer liberation lens. That as we are working, the folks who rose up to fight back against the deportation crisis in the community were and are queer, women, femme, trans Southeast Asian folks working to defend cis, male, Southeast Asian men. And that and part of part of how we're expanding that work and that vision is to also knowing that and having experience and trauma that for the past 20 years many of us had to endure struggle, right, and had to endure like assault and like homophobia, transphobia, and sexual assault, right, from our community members, from our loved ones who were broken by the system and in turn try to break us. But we had to be principled in that struggle and lean in to say that we have to stop these sort of like cycles that you're in, and we have to really work together. And so we're trying our hardest to figure out what RJ and TJ could look like in the anti-deportation movement, knowing that we're working with folks who've been totally broken by the system, but also knowing that we ourselves have been broken by the movement as well. But knowing that we're committed to have a principled struggle together to end deportation for our communities, but really end deportation for all. Yeah. Josie, I think you're muted. I think you're still muted, Josie.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, you all. Am I back? Okay? I apologize. Okay, we're back. So, what I was saying is that what I think you both are showing us and modeling for us are things that Black abolitionists have been showing us for decades, right? Is around creative and collective genius. That I think, especially for both of you, what both of you are showing is that there are the answers around reform are just not, they're not it, right? They're not it, and there's other models and other means that we need to do to keep ourselves safe and keep ourselves powerful, right? So in the last sort of bit for our panel here, the last question I have for you all, and I think you all have gestured towards this, is and Dylan Rodriguez has mentioned this as well in his opening Q&A, is as calls for anti-hate crime legislation are ramping up, how can Asian Americans support the calls and work for abolition? And I guess another way to ask this, right, is where does Asian American organizing and abolition intersect? And we'll go ahead and have that be our last question, if you all want to speak on that.
Sure. Yeah. And I just want to say that, like, listening to Saras speak and thinking about so I'm not like finished taking in what you just really beautifully shared. And I'm thinking of like Afghanistan, and the people are on my heart as well. I think we're seeing really horrific scenes of how the U.S. continues to fuck up, and then we just don't take care of the U.S. is in serious need of some TJ love. Okay, so, but I think in regards to the call for anti-hate crime legislation as it's ramping up, and I spoke about this before on another panel for ASC, and always my concern is, oh, okay, so the government wants to protect Asian people because there's like some violence that's happening against us. And then my first question that comes up is, how is this going to impact our community? What these Asian anti-hate crimes are really doing is it's expanding the police departments. They're creating larger patrol units in our neighborhoods, and it's always mind blowing to me when people are like, "Well, you don't see people in like La Jolla getting arrested," and it's like, yeah, and how many police stations do they have in La Jolla that are constantly driving up and down the street? Like, if you look for trouble, you're gonna find it. If you look for any kind of I have a goal. When you have your goals set, you're gonna meet them when you have so much power at your fingertips. And so I think of the last thing our community needs is more ICE agents, like looking into our communities, more police looking into our communities. It's actually further than what we need. And so I think there's this like false narrative that is trying to like, well, let's make sure folks feel safe. So as an elected official, I'm going to vote for this because I care for you. And especially when people are like, but hey, what about this? And I think of my grandparents. I'm a caretaker for Auntie Joy, the living legend. She truly is. She was born in a U.S. prison camp. She was born in 1942 while the U.S. Imprisoned Japanese Americans during World War II. My grandparents lost everything. They were told to pack up what they can carry, boarded on trains with no windows. Everything was covered, and taken out to the desert to live. And when people started questioning the government, initially it was like, well, we can't trust Japanese people. They're spies, and they're not really U.S. citizens, and they're not like this loyalty question came into play. But then the message that they were sending out to the rest of the country was, well, we also want to keep them safe. That's what Japanese people were then told. We're putting you here for your own safety because we can't control. Everyone else wants to harm you. So the best thing to do is to put you here locked away with guns pointed at you. And so I think when I hear any type of legislation come up, the first thing I think of is my family's trauma and history of having everything they built for taken away within a week, having to move to an environment that they had no idea, never been to, middle of the desert with no resources that they could create for their own. And so I don't have that trust that my benefit, my safety, and is at the core of these bills. So that's the first thing is I question, like, how is this going to impact here's the message we're receiving. What is the reality? And then what we can do is ask those questions and then get involved. I think, again, we need trust. We need to build that trust amongst each other. We need to have interpersonal relationships. If we want to be there when we're feeling hurt and harmed, we have to have that connection. And so I'm thinking of like how ASC, for example, like getting involved with Asian Solidarity Collective as one example, because we're here on this panel and celebrating the amazing work that's happened, is to think about like what this organization has created, which is community. It's created educational resources and tools. It's created mutual aid. It's like, and has engaged in other organizations' mutual aid. So I'm thinking of like, what ASC to me feels like is moving towards that alternative too. So if something goes down, I know folks I can turn to say, hey, I'm struggling right now. I need support. And I know I'm going to get it from people who have values that are aligned with mine. And so I think that's what's key. I think it's being around people invested in this work. Like, I didn't just wake up one day and say, I want to work towards abolition. Like, people invested in me. And if we're investing in other people that I'm thinking of, like, my political views. I have radically transformed from the person I was as a young person, because people invested in me and taught me so much. Everything that I share is not my own. I didn't just create it and think of it myself. It was, as Saratha said, it's because of Black abolitionists. It's because of the Black women leaders, Black trans women leaders, Black cisgender women leaders in my life, the people before me. And I think of how, again, model minority myth created to actually separate me from the very people who are helping me liberate myself and who I can then turn around and help in solidarity to liberate. Like, we're, the folks who are the most impacted by the history of this country and our systems are the very ones who've been the key to us unlocking what liberation can look like. And we absolutely cannot do this work in isolation. We cannot say, well, I'm not Black, so I'm not going to focus on their support. I've got to focus on my own people. That's all of us, right? And our liberations and our struggles are interconnected. You cannot deny that. And so I think of how do we get involved, and how do we continue making those connections? And for folks, like myself, sometimes I'm like super introverted and I'm like, I don't want to go in a room and talk to a bunch of folks. And then I'm like, oh, we have text messaging, thanks to disability justice and the deaf community. We have like all of these tools to really help keep us connected, no matter how people want to judge them, in ways that have always been created by people who've been left out. And so we have a lot to thank to those folks, and we have a lot we owe them to continue investing in the people that are so-called undesirables, to the people that we as in society continue to leave out of resources and leadership positions, and think that they're like, I'm thinking I was too much for people. Like, I'm trans, I've got all this stuff that I'm working through, and I'm just too much. And someone was like, you're not too much, and we deserve your too much. And I was like, wow, I had never heard that framing before. And it was so healing to know that I was worthy of investment. And like, I get emotional thinking about that, because like, I'm with my people, right? Like, if you're on this call and you're in these spaces, and I'm listening to like personal stories being shared over the day, and I'm like, it's worth investing in this space and in this movement, because we deserve it. That's all.
Thank you, AT. Okay, so much to say about this. Let's see. I think like these, I'm trying to think about sort of like this anti-Asian hate moment, and how we could, like how we could really turn into movements, right? Like, how do we connect it to current movements? And so, so like sort of in this past year, or I mean, even during like sort of start of COVID, right? Like when it was like sort of more talked about the anti-Asian hate stuff, I began to see that there was like clearly like organizations have different viewpoints, when it comes to like, some are recommending responses to, when people are recommending responses to the hate violence. There was ones who, for want more hate crimes framework to address, that they really want to rely on the police to document, investigate, and prosecute, right, on these acts of violence. And on the other hand, there's also been great to see that there are many Asian folks and Asian organizations who recommend a more transformative justice model, right, that really seeks to like limit and disentangle law enforcement from sort of these like sort of acts of harm. I'm really worried, although I'm really worried that our alliance and hate crime legislation, to like Asian Americans and Asian American organizations, and to call for more sentencing, which to me means more prison time, which means more prison beds, which means more prison guards, which means corporations get richer, etc. We know that. And that in this moment of racial reckoning, and in this current moment of anti-Asian violence, I want to believe that we as Asian Americans can dig a little bit deeper, dig a lot deeper, and think about how we respond, and like I want to ask us about how do we rely on structures that's always going to choose us over Black and Indigenous folks. It's always going to do that, right? And how we try harder, and I hope that we're kind of doing now, like folks like ASC and this panel and this conference, that we can find solutions to help build a better world, right? I think about what happens, when we rely on the system, rely on hate crime legislation, that what happens when what happens when law enforcement lawmakers are themselves white supremacists, right? I mean, BLM has taught us this and have shown the rotten core of policing and prisons in the US of how these systems actually work to uphold racial capitalism. And Asian Americans, that we're closer, that we like, that we're always going to get chosen over these folks. And that BLM has also taught us that while we work towards community solutions for abolition, we actually have to also contend with law and legislation and policy in order to provide some relief for some harm reduction, right? So please check out things like the Breathe Act. It's really beautiful, and it lays out a policy pathway forward for us. They also taught us that we can create policy and legislation that moves us towards abolition, like defund police campaigns happening across the country. And I believe that if we give everyone the resources they need to thrive, that we all need to thrive, that there will be less harm done to one another, and that there'll be more openness to building racial love and solidarity, and that, really ultimately that white supremacy can be abolished and vanquished. I also know that we as Asian Americans, we know that our communities have practiced models of accountability and address hurt and harm, before the advent of police and prisons here in the U.S. and before our communities came into the U.S. I want us to dig a little bit deeper and find those models and traditions and practice them again. So that's sort of me. What I just really want for us Asian Americans to really contend with this in this moment. Because I think that we have to, as a movement, really, and as a community, really need to get it together, like really figure these contradictions out, and be on the right side of justice. Last thing I want to say is, I think there is a danger in sort of, for me, hate crime legislation, call for more policing and stuff. That's a symptom of the rising of an even more powerful neoliberalism in this country. And I really want us as Asian Americans to like sort of be aware of that and move ourselves away from that, right? So one quick thing is like, when we saw all the stuff that was happening around Afghanistan this past week, one, it was triggering as heck for like Southeast Asian folks, to sort of watch all the videos and photos and to hear all the comparisons to Vietnam and all that happened there. And I've been seeing a lot of responses being to accept refugees, you have to accept refugees. And I think one abolitionist way of thinking about it is to, and I know that, me and Stephen are thinking about it, is that we have to say it's not enough to just accept these refugees, you accept them all, right? But we can't just accept them and put them into the same conditions that will set them up for deportation 25 years later. Those young, those young kids and children that are in those planes that are the same ones that the U.S. is going to deport in 25 and 30 years. I know that because that happened to Southeast Asians. That's happening to Southeast Asians. And so we don't change the conditions in where we're bringing refugees to, then we're just recycling, right? And we're just building stronger this racial capitalist system the U.S. has. And so I say, accept refugees, but also just defund the U.S. military and dismantle the U.S. military and get the U.S. military out of countries, and stop making refugees like Southeast Asians, like those Afghani refugees that we're seeing.
Well, we're at time just so much appreciation for you, AT, for you, Sarath, for your work, for your presence today, for just building. Really looking forward to continuing to build with you all through ASC. So much gratitude for Stephanie. Thank you so much for the tremendous work to make this panel accessible. Really appreciative. So I'm just going to continue to kind of process what you all are saying and turn it over to the organizers. But thank you all so much.
Wow. Still it's gonna take me a while to get over that. What a panel. I think if there are other ASC members here, I think you know that we cry really easily and often. So thank you all for sharing such beautiful words. Can we put some hearts and hand claps in the chat for these folks? Thank you for sharing your too much with us and for reminding us to channel our anger and frustration and to hold each other in close relationship and be willing to transform. I have learned so much by being in community with other members of ASC, and I appreciate everything that this organization and that you folks have given me and all of us here today. I hope everyone is feeling this grounding of support that our panelists have offered us today. So our next event is going to begin at 11:40 in the sessions room, and you're not going to want to miss that. For a little bit of instructions on how to find the session, on the side panel of the Hop-In platform you're currently in, you should see an icon with the word sessions, which you can click on to enter a session area that is currently happening. You can also enter through the reception area to see the full summit schedule for the day. And we've got a lot of good stuff happening today. The next panel that's coming up is we'll be learning from parent and community organizers from Police Free LAUSD, who have so much to celebrate and to teach us. And so we'll see you over in the session soon. Thanks all.